Bible Sleuth here, and I'm back continuing from the last episode where we looked at the unjust steward. As I mentioned before, I have come to believe the unjust steward was told as a setup for the rich man and Lazarus, and I hope to uncover why I believe that in this episode. As a recap, Jesus was talking to his disciples while directing his discussions at scoffing Pharisees that were quite upset at Jesus for the things he was saying and the company he was keeping. He had just explained why he befriended the common people through a series of parables, how God seeks out the lost in humility. And if you haven't seen the Lost video series, you should check them out. Jesus shows God's love even in the most humiliating and intimate of relationships. So this obviously upset the religious folk who were probably making a bunch of noise in the background. This in turn spawned possibly one of his strangest of parables, the unjust steward, which set the stage for the parable today. Let's head to the gruesome scene in Luke 16, 19 through 31. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us." And he said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." In this investigation, I want to start a bit differently than I have in other cases, and that is to look at it from a literary perspective. We have 2 characters that are not necessarily antagonistic. However, what happens to them and the contrasting events that develop in each character arc is antagonistic. Beginning with a rich man, we see a person of seeming ruling class who lived a lavish lifestyle and appears to have all that can be desired. There is no apparent goal of him because he has everything. On the other hand, we have Lazarus, whose lot in life is not pleasant, his major obstacles being poor, hungry, and in poor health. Jesus paints a sad picture. His goal was to eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. However, there are some subtleties about Lazarus that may suggest more about him. First, he was laid at the entrance of the rich man's home. I get the impression that this was a daily activity. The text doesn't say much else. Someone did that for Lazarus, indicating his inability to walk, but also hinting to a relationship with at least one other person. He had a friend, as well as some sort of comfort from the dogs that came and licked his sores. This bit of information lends to some assumptions on the part of the rich man that would imply a character flaw. If Lazarus was placed at his gate daily to beg, then the rich man showed a great deal of indifference towards Lazarus and probably even disgust for him being ceremonially unclean. The sores on Lazarus were probably oozing and smelly in order to attract the dogs to lick his sores. Leviticus 13:10 through 15 says, "Anyone who develops a serious skin disease must go to the priest for an examination. If the priest finds a white swelling on the skin and some hair on the spot has turned white, and there is an open sore in the affected area, it is a chronic skin disease. And the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. In such cases, the person need not be quarantined, for it is obvious that the skin is defiled by the disease. Now suppose the disease has spread all over the person's skin, covering the body from head to foot. When the priest examines the infected person and finds the disease covers the entire body, he will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. Since the skin has turned completely white, the person is clean. But if an open sore appears, the infected person will be pronounced ceremonially unclean. The priest must make this pronouncement as soon as he sees an open sore, since open sores indicate the presence of a skin disease." Lazarus' goal of crumbs actually was the one and only goal he could muster, when in truth his real goal would have been to be able to go to the temple to worship God. However, because of his uncleanness, he would not have been allowed to do that. It was because of his condition that his livelihood confined him to the circumstances. Rules for beggars may have limited him as well, which was why he was laid at the rich man's gate. To get near him, the rich man would have run the risk of becoming ceremonially unclean. For a religious ruler, that would not have been acceptable. This notion is repeated in the parable of the Good Samaritan, dealt with in another episode. Let's stop and go back to the previous parable, where the unjust steward plundered the rich man in order to secure himself a place to go when the rich man put him out of the stewardship. One of the confusing statements made was, "And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations." Both Lazarus and the rich man made friends of treasure, even in Lazarus' impoverished state. However, we see that this rich man had made friends out of the unrighteous mammon. How is it unrighteous? Go back to Deuteronomy 15:7 through 9. "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns or the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin." Usually death is the end of a character in a story, but this is not the case here. We suddenly find roles are reversed for Lazarus and the rich man, and I do want to point out a distinction that was made. Lazarus died and was carried by angels to Abraham's bosom, while the rich man was buried. I do find that unique. From that point on, Lazarus is out of the scene. His ultimate goal was realized, his arc was complete, and he found comfort. What occurs is the animation of the former rich man, with dialogue that ensues between him and Abraham. In this discourse, there is possibly a slight hint that if Lazarus was even aware of the rich man's torment and request, he might have been willing to have answered the request, which further outlines the completeness of Lazarus' character. Perhaps the comfort that was mentioned and the allusion to the gulf fixed between served as a shroud or veil blocking the torment that was being felt by those who were buried, an argument against those who cannot fathom the existence of hell. Notice that Abraham didn't say Lazarus wouldn't, he said he couldn't. Tragically, for the rich man who had made friends with unrighteous mammon, his everlasting habitation was definitely not what he expected. Unlike Lazarus, I don't believe the rich man completes his character arc, even though he is in great torment. I believe it's because of his inability to change. Does anyone else find it audacious for him to ask for Lazarus to come and serve him by dipping the tip of his finger in cold water to cool his tongue? And when that wouldn't work, he asked for him to go back and speak to his brothers. I still see a sense of lack of repentance as well as arrogance in this man. It's almost as though he had become antagonistic towards Lazarus after death because he sees him comforted. Jesus told another story that was recorded in Matthew 25, a story that supports this concept. In one portion of the story, he said, "Then he will say to those on the left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me.' They also will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick in prison, and did not help you?' He will reply, 'Truly, I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me.'" Very sobering, don't you think? It makes me want to sit down and reevaluate. How about you? There is a potential prophetic message in this parable that is also sobering, and may have been why the name Lazarus was used. Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead shortly before his crucifixion. He also knew that it was these same people who would threaten to seize Lazarus and do him in, because people were believing in Jesus because of his resurrection. Murder. For what reason? Jesus spends several moments between these parables discussing faithfulness in small things, faithfulness in others, as well as divorcing one's wife and marrying someone else. It is vaguely close to Exodus 22, 1 through 17. The Pharisees were not living under the rules that they created, many which did not necessarily follow the Mosaic law found in Exodus. I believe he was pointing that out through the law. One thing I wanted to look at specifically was Luke 16:11. "If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches?" This ties the two parables together, as I mentioned. The unjust servant sets the stage in the parable of the rich man, and Lazarus ultimately becomes the climactic event that drives home the notion that true riches are actually entrusted in one who is faithful, even in the small things. However, unfaithfulness yields grave consequences. I have one question that many may be asking. Are we getting a glimpse into the afterlife, so to speak? And here's what I think. I don't know. However, I tend to think yes and maybe no, and I will explain. Interestingly, it seems that the glimpses we get from Jesus leans more towards hell than heaven. Actually, there is very little spoken by him as a way of describing heaven, unless you include what he says to John in Revelation. One commentator I came across on this topic spoke that the scenario that Jesus was describing in this parable was pre-resurrection, indicating that there were two distinct regions where the righteous and the unrighteous went following death. But when Jesus died, he descended into hell and preached and emptied Abraham's bosom. I don't know if this is accurate, but Matthew 27:53 would argue something like that happened during the period of Jesus' death and resurrection. The graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Peter mentioned this in 1 Peter 3:19 through 20, saying, "He went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. Paul alluded to it as well in Ephesians 4:9-10. Wherefore he saith, When he ascended upon high, he led captivity captive, and gave gifts unto men. Now that he ascended, what is it but that he also descended first to the lower parts of the earth? Back to the question of heaven and hell. The parable does give us a perspective that hell is not going to be pleasant, either physically, mentally, or spiritually. I also think it gives us a sneak glimpse into that those who wind up in hell, they do so out of their own arrogance and rebellion, which evidently doesn't stop when they get there, meaning repentance doesn't take place there either. A fair warning also, there is a hint that the rich man was a religious person. How do I know? He called Abraham father. So here's a question. Why did Jesus talk so much about hell and very little about heaven if he wanted us to go to heaven? So I'm going to postulate a few theories here. Granted, they are theories that have biblical background for support. Theory 1. He wanted to scare people out of going there. He warned that it was not a place to go. Hell ain't no joke. I already mentioned Matthew 25:41, but let's look at it closer. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Notice what Jesus said about hell here. It was prepared for the devil and his angels, and it is an everlasting fire. For a who's more powerful standpoint, if Satan and his angels are not wanting this, why would feeble humans think they are going to be partying there? What is my proof of this angelic fear? Let's look at Luke 8:27-33. And they arrived at the country of the Gadarenes, which is over against Galilee. And when they went forth to land, there met him out of the city a certain man which had devils long time, and wear no clothes, neither abode in any house, but in the tombs. Mark describes the man more in depth in chapter 5:3-4, who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because he had often been bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces. Neither could any man tame him. Look what the demons do and say to Jesus. First, they are compelled to run to him, fall before him, and worship Jesus. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him. Mark uses the word worship. That should give us a perspective on who Jesus is. His very presence commanded worship from these demons. Look too what they say. And with a loud voice said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God, Most High? I beseech thee, torment me not. What followed is a brief exposition about the moment, and then we find this description of what they begged of Jesus. And they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the deep. The word used in the KJV is deep, but the actual word was this, and it's pronounced abuthsos. That is where the word abyss comes from. If the demons tremble at the notion of hell, what gives people the idea that it will be a fun place? Theory 2. Heaven's true description cannot be understood by human language. Ezekiel is one of the most prolific Old Testament pictures of heaven, and yet there are elements that suggest that understanding of what he saw was indescribable. And that goes for Daniel as well. Look what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12:3-4. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth, how that he was caught up in paradise and heard unspeakable words, which it was not lawful for a man to utter. He was talking about boasting to give context, so he referred to himself in the third person as to not boast. However, what he saw was even unlawful to utter or unspeakable. There are still references to God that are not allowed to be spoken in Jewish tradition, but the words used for paradise and lawful both lean to existence. Such things are beyond human existence, beyond human words or imagination. Now let that one sink in. If anyone could have described heaven, Jesus could have, but he chose not to, obviously because of our inability to comprehend it or the price he would pay for us to go there to be with him. I think a possible correlation that can be found is earthly treasure is as contrasting to heavenly treasure as heaven is to hell. Now that is a very significant statement considering our inability to grasp what heaven is like. I don't know about you, but I look forward to the day when I can see Jesus face to face. A day that is soon approaching, by the way.